Hello, happy Monday. Welcome back to my Speech Talks series. I'm Lauren Jackson, speech language pathologist at Millersville Elementary School. I also have a teeny tiny little private practice on the side that has been sadly on hold for the last 8 weeks or so, and I can't wait to get back to it. But I'm back again today to talk to you some more about language development, particularly for our kids on the spectrum. So I think I gave you a little teaser in my video last week about what we were going to talk about this week. And what we are going to talk about is one of the most interesting topics in language development for kids on the autism spectrum, and that is echolalia. So if you are watching this and you are a parent of a child on the spectrum, you probably know exactly what I mean. If you have encountered a child in your life on the spectrum, you also probably are pretty familiar with what I mean. So echolalia is the repeated use of words and phrases. And there are a few different kinds that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about how they're used and why and what we should do about it. But I did want to just give you kind of a little bit of a language development background and my opinion kind of on what echolalia means as far as language development for kids on the spectrum. So we've been talking, of course, about our language development staircase, and I'll just reinforce, you guys should be pros by now if you've been following me for the last few weeks, but of course we talk about how language is a staircase and the bottom steps are that sensory integration, regulation, and engagement, that we want those pieces to be there. And for lots of our kids on the spectrum, they have lots of holes as they work their way up to language and then higher level thinking. And we've talked a little bit about how some kids get stuck kind of right around here in what we like to call rote language land, right? And one of the reasons I proposed that is difficult for them is because of these holes and because they lack the intrinsic motivation to communicate. So we have to build and develop that through communication temptations and prompting. But I also wanted to talk to you guys about something else that I think happens on this language development staircase for kids on the spectrum. And that is that for kids on the spectrum, I really think in addition to following these typical language development steps, so if you think about it, babies have the cooing where they're making noises and interacting with you, and that cooing eventually moves to babbling where they're making reduplicated sounds kind of over and over. Those sounds start to match your intonation pattern. They start to make a little bit more sense, and then there are words. You get your first word and you think that your heart, it could not possibly explode any more than it does, right, when you hear that first word. So for a lot of our kids on the spectrum, that first word can be pretty delayed. And I know, as parents, that's got to be difficult, right? So the pattern of development for our kids on the spectrum is usually a little bit off. They will often make those beginning sounds. They'll also do some of the babbling, but a lot of times those words don't come in the way that they do for typical children. And that is because I propose they're not processing language the same way that the rest of us do. And if you listen to a person on the autism spectrum talk about their experiences, if you are so lucky as to ever listen to Temple Grandin speak, for example, they'll talk to you about how things do not come in and process the way that they normally do. So they don't interact with words and language the way that a neurotypical person would. So while they may coo and they may babble, those first words might be delayed, they're not going to start sort of playing around with language the way that a lot of our kids do, where they're putting words together and experimenting with sounds. A lot of times that doesn't happen. For a lot of kids on the spectrum, sometimes you're going to get this weird burst of like a whole phrase, and you're saying to yourself, where did that come from? They've learned and memorized that whole phrase as a phrase, but they don't right now understand the individual words. So they might at some point when it's bath time say to you, it's time for bath, but they don't know what it's means. They don't know what time means. They don't know what for means. They don't know really what bath means. They have just processed that string of syllables, it's time for bath, as a string of syllables, and they're going to say it every time. So that is an example of what we might call echolalia. And for a lot of kids on the spectrum, it's going to be tiny. I propose that they have an extra step in their language development, and I call that the echolalia step. So I really think that a lot of our kids on the spectrum have to add that extra step in as a language processing step as they're working their way up here. So let's dive in a little bit and talk a little bit more about what echolalia really is. So there's 3 different kinds that I have experienced in my time as a speech therapist. There's immediate echolalia, delayed echolalia, and mitigated. So immediate is one that I'm sure you're familiar with. So this is in an example I gave a few weeks ago. When you go to the store, you run into friends, you see them and you say, look, Lily, there's John, say hi to John. And Lily says, hi to John. She's echoing, she's immediately echoing my words or phrases. Sometimes you'll say to your child, do you want some milk? They'll say milk. They won't say yes or no, they'll say milk, or they might say the whole phrase, do you want some milk? That kind of immediate echolalia where it's right after you've been talking serves a number of different purposes. And I really want you guys to all think about echolalia as this necessary step. Okay? It's annoying. It can be quite annoying. I understand that. All kids are kind of annoying in their own way. And this is a piece that can get frustrating because you just want them to answer you in the typical way. I get it. Of course I get it. But I really want you guys to try and shake up your thinking and think about this echolalia as this intermediate step between the scripting and the babbling and the cooing and functional language. They're learning to use language in their own way, in a different way, but it's not a wrong way. It's just different, and we sort of have to reorganize our thinking around it. So one way that I think kids use that immediate echolalia is to give themselves some time to process and to think. A lot has to go on in the brain when we ask an autistic child a question. A lot has to go on in the brain. So they have to listen and hear your words. They have to decipher all the sounds. They have to put the sounds together and make those sounds into syllables and make those sounds into words and then combine those words into sentences. And then they have to take the overall meaning of the sentence and process that. And then let's say they get through all that, then they have to say, well, how do I feel about that? What's my response? Do I want milk or do I want something else? So then they kind of have to decide, and then they have to figure out how to translate those thoughts into words that make sense. That's a lot to do. And for kids whose brains are not wired in the same way as yours or mine, that's gonna take them some time, especially when they're tiny little humans. So I think a lot of times our kids are gonna use that immediate echolalia as a time for processing. I'm even gonna write that. So processing, giving themselves some time. I also think a way that they're also using the immediate echolalia as a way of just showing that they're here, interacting with you. They may not have all the words, but they don't want you to miss them. They don't want you to give up on them. They want you to still be present with them. They want you to know that they are present with you. I think there's a fallacy of thinking out there that children who echo in this way aren't really listening to you. And I really think that's quite false, that they're just in their own world. I think that that is a fallacy. I don't think that's true. I 100% believe that our children are hearing us and listening to us, and they can't come up with the words to get it out in the appropriate way at that time. Maybe they need more time. Maybe they don't have the words at all. That's kind of where I come in, is to try and help develop those words. So I really want you to shake off the thought, shake it off, that they're not listening to you. I believe that they are listening to you, and that using this immediate echolalia is a way of giving them time to process, and also letting them show you that they're present, that they're here, that they know you're waiting for them to say something, so they're gonna say something. It doesn't exactly always match up with what you want to hear, but they're saying something, they're there. So I really want you to think about that they use it for presence and engagement. And then of course, they are also using it to communicate. So let's say, this happens to me all the time. I would say with 60 to 70% of my students on the spectrum. If I use one of the prompting methods that I showed you last week, where you're providing them choices, right? So we'll say, Aaron, do you want to play with the Legos, or do you want to play with the Play-Doh? Aaron will generally say Play-Doh, which is what I say last. So then if I switch it and I say, Aaron, do you want to play with Play-Doh or do you want to play Legos? He's going to say Legos because that's what I said last. So we could read into that and realize Aaron might be happy playing with either one of those things. And if he's not happy with either one or the other, then he's going to show us. So a lot of times by repeating the last thing that they hear, they're kind of showing that they might be agreeing with you. Because a lot of times if I said to Aaron, do you want to play with Legos? And he didn't, he would just not answer me. Or he would push it away, or as he got a little bit older, he would say, no Legos. He figured out how to respond in a more socially acceptable way. But initially he was just doing a lot of repeating and just doing a lot of echoing. And that was showing me that he was taking in what I was hearing, but he just didn't quite know what to do with it at that point. So that's another reason for immediate echolalia. So then there's also the reason that for a lot of our kids, it's fun. It's just fun. It makes them happy, right? It makes them happy. It could serve as a self-soothing kind of thing. It could serve as a self-regulation kind of thing. Saying words over and over again gives them that time to process. And maybe they like the way those sounds go together. Maybe they like the way it sounds. Maybe it has a musical quality to them that they like. So they're going to say it again. So a lot of times it's just fun. It may not necessarily be there to serve a communication function for you, for them. It's just for fun. It's just for enjoyment. And that's okay too. That's okay. We want them to find things that make them happy, and we want to support the things that make them happy. So I'm going to go ahead and go down here to talk about delayed echolalia, because delayed echolalia is a lot the same. A lot of the reasons for doing it are the same, but the form it takes is different, and this one can be a little bit more confusing. So delayed echolalia is the repetition, generally of longer words and sentences or phrases that are not necessarily from right before. So it's something that they like, that they have in their heads. Maybe it's a script from a movie or a TV show. There's a lot of those out there. Maybe there are scripts from things that you have said as a parent. Maybe there are scripts that are part of a routine. I mean, if you think about it, we all use social scripts, right? Every day when I'm in the real world with actual humans that I get to interact with and not my video camera, I'm walking down the hall at work and I see a friend. Hey, Miss M. Hey, Miss Jackson. How are you today? I'm well. You? Almost every time. That's my response. I'm well. You? It's easy. It gets me through that interaction and I get to move on. So we all use delayed echolalia in a lot of different ways. I open my videos the same way most of the time. I might change the words up a little bit. That's mitigated echolalia, but we're not there yet. So delayed echolalia can be tough to sort of track down. With immediate echolalia, it's usually a little bit easier to figure out what the intent of the echo is and what the meaning of it is. Sometimes with delayed echolalia, it can be really tricky because a lot of times maybe a student will be quoting from one of their favorite movies and you don't necessarily understand the connection, but maybe the question is, how do you feel today? And they respond to you something from like Elf, Buddy the Elf, what's your favorite color? Because that movie makes them happy and they're trying to tell you that they feel happy, right? So there are a lot of times some super cool connections to be found, but we don't always know what they are. And I have gotten to a place with several of my students where they can sort of explain where it came from and why. It gets there, right? But it does take some time. And even some of the most functional, verbal, communicative people on the spectrum that I have had the opportunity of hearing talk, watching YouTube videos, meeting myself, even those high functioning, I don't love that word, but even those more verbal individuals will say to you that they script all the time because it makes them feel good. It makes them happy. And sometimes they don't always know what to say in the situation, so they script. I do this all the time. When my kids get a little bit older and they're a little bit more verbal, we work on social scripting. We turn this echolalia from something that maybe isn't the most socially acceptable to something that makes a little bit more sense. Because what will happen is kids will start doing this immediate echolalia and they'll just repeat you right back at you as a way to process, as a way to buy themselves time. And then eventually what they might do is start using those words and phrases in a little bit of a functional way. Like my little buddy Camden in Miss Palmer's class, he always talks about random stuff, but the more clear his speech became, the more we realized, oh, he's saying things, scripts and things that actually make sense. He's telling that friend to stop it. He's figured out how to use a script that he's heard from teachers or from other people as a functional way to direct the behavior of others. So as they're working their way up this ladder, they take this echolalia, which seems very non-functional, and they start to turn it into functional things. They start to use those scripts in an appropriate time with an appropriate partner, right? And then eventually they start to do what we call the mitigated echolalia, where they use some of the words, but maybe start to throw in some of their own words. They learn to do a mixture. But those social scripts and those echolalic scripts that they have built in becomes a really important stepping stone, extra step as they work their way up that language of that ladder staircase of language development. So I feel like echolalia is confusing to the listener, and it can be frustrating to the speaker when they're saying words that mean something to them, that garner a feeling in them, and the listener isn't picking it up. So right now, because you're the grown-up and you have access to a lot more words and a lot more critical thinking, the onus is on you to try and do a little research and figure out where some of those scripts are coming from. I can't tell you the number of aha moments I've had with parents where we've realized, oh my gosh, that's what that's from. So it's been something that's been going on in speech, and they'll go home and say it to the parents, and they have no idea where it came from. I had no idea they were doing it. We finally get together and chat, and she'll say, oh, that makes so much more sense now, right? So I feel like I've been rambling a little bit today. This topic makes me happy. I just think it's so important. And I think changing our way of thinking about echolalia is so important because it is a really important and I think necessary intermediate step for these kids on the spectrum to get to more novel and functional language. They learn these words and phrases as chunks and as words and phrases. They might not necessarily know what they mean individually. A lot of times this is why there's pronoun problems with our kids on the spectrum, because they learn these rote phrases. So it's your turn, and they'll say it's your turn when it's actually their turn, right? That's such a hard habit to break, but they've learned those words as a script without knowing what the your and the my mean, right? So that's why it's so important, and here's my plug, to work on core vocabulary with these students. Those tiny little words that I talked about in another video that have so much meaning across the English language. That's why I focus on that in my speech sessions, because they make such a world of difference. Okay, I am rambling, but I have one more little soapbox thing that I want to talk to you about when it comes to echolalia. So I think a lot of times we want to push our kids to get rid of the echolalia, right? We want them to respond in socially acceptable ways. Of course we do, but I really want you to think about what I said about how happy it generally makes them. It's enjoyable for them. We might not understand why, although I will tell you, I have a neurotypical 7-year-old, and we get in the car and she asks me to make a playlist for her on my phone before we start driving somewhere. If we're going to be driving for more than 10 minutes, she wants a playlist of songs, and it's generally 2 songs long. Sometimes she just wants the same song over and over and over again. And this child is verbal. She is beyond verbal. She is with it. She is socially appropriate. She is a very cognitively straightforward kid. And I'm like, what? Why do you do this? Why don't you just want to listen to different songs? And she's like, she literally said to me just last week, they make me happy. She doesn't care that it's repeated over and over. It makes her happy. So I want you to ask yourself, do you want your kids to be socially appropriate, or do you want them to express themselves in the way that brings them joy and makes them feel the most comfortable? Because here's the thing. I believe that our children are going to communicate in the easiest way possible. I think we as humans do that. We do the things in the way that we have discovered that's the easiest way possible for us, the way that we're the most comfortable. It really takes a lot of effort to push ourselves out of our comfort zone. I'm staring over here because my weights are lined up on the floor over there, and I haven't touched them in over a year. I know that the weights will make my body thinner and stronger, and I know they're good for me, but it is hard for me. I hate it, so I don't do it. I don't do it. For kids who are learning to respond in a more typical way, it's hard. As I explained to you all the steps that they have to go through, it's so hard for them, right? So I think a lot of times using those scripts, falling back on those scripts is easy. It's less tiring, it's less work. So I really think that it's important that we push them, that we try to teach them more functional responses, teaching them even the response of, I don't know, that social script. Or I have a student now who's an adult, and if you ask her a question and she doesn't understand, she'll go, what? That is perfect, because it allows the conversation to continue. It's functional language. We as neurotypical people know what to do with that, and it's not necessarily a script. So an echolalic script, it's more of a social script. So she has learned a way to be more functional in that environment and not necessarily script all the time. However, girlfriend still scripts the whole time I'm at her house for speech. It makes her happy. It fills the conversation time. It gives her things to say. I participate in those scripts with her. I go back and forth. I repeat what she asks me to repeat. I ask her questions about what she's talking about to try and get her to tell me how her scripts apply to this particular situation. I make them funny. I try to make them silly. I try to engage with her. And I believe wholeheartedly that the number one reason that girl connected with me and has stayed connected with me for 15 years now is because I got in there and I talked to her in her words. Those scripts were her words. I got in there and I talked to her that way. And I really think that willingness of mine to get on her level and get in her headspace, or my attempt to anyway, and to not force her to come into mine all day, every day, I really think that did wonders to build our relationship. And I believe that we have a relationship now, she and I. It's a true, loving, give and take relationship. Is it the same as my relationship with other students, with my daughter, with my friends? No, it's not. It's Leah's relationship. It's our relationship. It's how we relate. It's different, but it's there. And it was because I chose not to think of her echolalia as something annoying, as something I wanted to get rid of and break, but as a part of who she is, and as a part of her grasping language, her learning language, her processing language, and her just showing the world that she's here, that she's present, and that we should listen to her. So please, I want you to try and think about your students' echolalia in that way. I think it's gonna do you a whole world of good, okay? All right, guys, I'm still mulling over what my next week's theme is gonna be, but it's gonna be good, I promise. Come back and check me out next week. I hope that this was helpful to you, and I hope you're staying well and healthy. Take care.